When I finally opened the burner phone, I didn't just find messages. I found a life I never knew I was part of. I remember standing in my bedroom that evening, holding the sleek, black device in my hand like it was a bomb about to explode. The hum of the ceiling fan, the faint scent of jasmine from the candle on the dresser, the distant sound of cars outside. It all seemed irrelevant, muted. Everything else faded except the screen lighting up in my palm. I should probably start from the beginning. My name is Clara, and for 3 years, I had been with Mark. Mark, who smiled so easily, whose voice could melt my exhaustion after a long day at work. The kind of man whose laugh became the rhythm of your own heartbeat. I loved him, truly, and I believed we were building something real. Our little apartment, our Saturday morning coffee rituals, the way he always left the kitchen spotless. Small details, I thought, meant love. Life with him was ordinary in the best way. He worked in finance, I in a small graphic design firm, and our days followed a rhythm of work, quiet dinners, and occasional outings with friends. I knew his family, the way his mother fussed over him when he visited, how his younger brother clung to his every word, how everyone assumed I was just as attentive to them. There was warmth in it, familiarity, a feeling that I had found my place. But ordinary can be deceptive. It started with small things. I noticed him taking calls in the bathroom, his tone sharper, more secretive than usual. Sometimes he would leave for late meetings that didn't exist, or claim he was running errands when I'd see him drive past our street in the opposite direction. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. I told myself, "Don't be paranoid, Clara. You're reading too much into nothing." But the pit in my stomach kept growing. The doubt was a whisper at first, then a scream I couldn't silence. One morning, I noticed his phone sitting on the kitchen counter, screen unlocked. There were hundreds of notifications, messages from a name I didn't recognize. Laura. My fingers itched to check them, to see what he was hiding, but I hesitated. Part of me wanted to believe in him, in us. Part of me knew that if I looked, the world I'd built in my mind might crumble. That night, I went to bed with that gnawing uncertainty, gnawing deeper than hunger or fatigue ever could. It wasn't long after that I made the decision. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't live in the shadow of doubt, wondering if every late text, every whispered call, every sudden trip was a dagger aimed at the heart of my trust. I swapped his phone for a burner, a replica I had prepped carefully over days. It had the same case, the same wallpaper, even the same lock tone. He wouldn't notice. And if he did, I told myself, I would know everything. The first day with the swapped phone was quiet. Mark went about his routine, oblivious. I watched him, studied the way he moved through the apartment, the casual confidence in his posture, the smiles he flashed at me. Everything looked normal. That night, I stayed awake, burning through every message, every call log. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't just flirting, not just late-night texts. It was something I hadn't imagined possible. She was there in the minutiae of his life, lunch plans, weekend trips, inside jokes. And worse, she wasn't hiding from his family. She was part of it. Invitations to dinners, mentions of holidays together, photos he sent secretly but confidently. He had woven her into a life that was supposed to be ours, and I had never seen it. The shock hit me first. My chest constricted, my vision blurred. Then came the fury, the betrayal. I had spent years trusting him, opening my heart completely, and here he was, living a secret double life. I thought of every whispered excuse, every promise broken, every night I fell asleep alone while he was with her. I could feel the betrayal in the room, in the air itself, thick and suffocating. I didn't confront him immediately. I watched. I listened. I recorded. Every call he made, every message he sent, every casual lie he whispered into his phone. It became a ritual, almost clinical, as though I were cataloging the anatomy of betrayal itself. I had a plan. I wasn't going to collapse under this. I was going to face it, expose it, and reclaim my dignity. I remember the night vividly. He was in the living room pretending to read a financial report. His hands were steady, his posture casual. But I had all I needed. I waited until the moment was right, until his entire family was gathered for a Sunday dinner, everyone unsuspecting. The smell of roasted chicken, garlic bread, and baked apples filled the air, mingling with laughter and chatter. Everything seemed ordinary. But I knew it wasn't. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every second, every heartbeat. I held the burner phone like a detonator, my thumb hovering over the playback of the first recorded call. My eyes scanned the room. There was his mother, bustling with pride. His father, talking about stocks. His younger brother, oblivious, sipping soda. And him, Mark, completely at ease, completely unaware that the truth was about to sweep through this room like a hurricane. The first clip played. His voice familiar and warm, casually speaking to her, laughter interspersed, intimate, unguarded. The room fell silent. You could hear the hum of the chandelier, the fork scraping the plate. Faces froze, eyes widened. Then his mother looked at him, confusion and horror spreading across her features. His father's hands dropped to his lap, jaw tight. And Mark, he just stared at me, as though seeing me for the first time. Realization crashing down in waves of disbelief. It wasn't the first call alone that shattered the room. It was the series of messages, the evidence, the undeniable proof of a life I had no part in, meticulously documented. Every lie he had whispered to me, every false excuse, laid bare in front of those who mattered most to him. I stayed calm, my voice steady when I finally spoke. Do you want to explain this? Mark's eyes darted between his family and me. His confidence crumbled, his smile faltered. He opened his mouth then closed it. The silence was deafening. I let it linger. It was the first time I realized the power of clarity, of truth. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to plead. I simply presented the facts, one after another, letting the evidence speak. And the room, which had been full of warmth, chatter, and comfort, transformed into a chamber of judgment, of reckoning. By the end of that night, Mark was sitting alone, his family quietly processing, the magnitude of his actions settling in like a weight on all of them. I left the table, walking to my apartment in the cool night air. The scent of jasmine and damp earth enveloping me. Breathing in freedom I hadn't felt in years. I didn't look back. The next morning, sunlight slanted through my blinds, casting thin stripes across the floor. I sat at the edge of my bed, the hum of the city outside mingling with the silence in my apartment. My hands trembled slightly as I sipped my coffee, tasting the bitterness more sharply than usual. It wasn't sadness I felt, not exactly. It was clarity, a cold, almost surgical awareness of what I had endured and what I had done. I replayed last night over and over in my mind. The way Mark had gone from smug and untouchable to completely undone. The slight tremor in his hands. The way his mother had looked at me with a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. The quiet disappointment in his younger brother's eyes. Every detail etched itself into memory, but there was also a strange serenity in knowing the truth was out. I didn't need to yell, scream, or plead. Facts alone had dismantled him. For the next few days, life became a strange rhythm of silence and observation. I avoided Mark's messages and calls, letting them sit unanswered, unread. Each notification on my phone made me flinch, a reflex I couldn't quite erase. But I didn't reach out. I didn't want reconciliation. I wanted resolution. And while part of me ached with grief over what we had once been, another part felt an unfamiliar weight lift, like a rope fraying and finally snapping. I spent the mornings walking through the small park near my apartment, listening to the crunch of leaves under my shoes, watching the way sunlight danced through the branches. I thought about the signs I had ignored, the late-night calls, the whispered excuses, the moments when intuition had screamed and I had silenced it with hope. It wasn't my fault that he had deceived me. That truth was something I clung to like a lifeline. By midweek, Mark's family reached out. His mother called, her voice hesitant but not accusatory. She asked to meet me at a cafe nearby, a quiet place with soft jazz playing in the background. When I arrived, she was already there, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Her eyes, rimmed with sleepless nights, met mine, searching for answers. I didn't know, she stammered. I had no idea any of this. I know, I said softly, my voice calm. And you couldn't have. But now you do. And that matters. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the table, and I saw genuine remorse. She wasn't guilty of his actions, but she carried the weight of family loyalty, of trust betrayed. We spoke for an hour, unpacking everything with measured words. She admitted that she had always admired the way I supported Mark, how patient and understanding I had been, and that she now saw a truth she could not ignore. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. By the time we left, there was a tentative understanding. I didn't forgive him, not yet. Forgiveness, I realized, was something I owed to myself first, not to the man who had shattered my trust. But I could start with clarity, with strength, with reclaiming the narrative of my life that he had tried to rewrite. At work, I found myself focusing differently. The designs I created seemed sharper, more deliberate. My conversations with colleagues carried an undercurrent of calm authority I hadn't noticed before. It was as though shedding the weight of deception had freed a part of me I hadn't realized existed. I began keeping a journal again, writing late at night in the soft lamplight, documenting thoughts, feelings, plans, and reflections. The act of writing was like exhaling after holding my breath for too long. Then came the awkward encounters. Grocery stores, cafes, even the little boutique around the corner. Mark appeared here and there, but always cautiously, nervously. His attempts to speak were met with my polite distance. I could see the shame etched into his posture, the hollow smile he tried to force, the fleeting glances at my eyes that begged for something I could no longer give. It was in these moments, as I moved through the world with a quiet dignity, that I realized how much power truth holds. Not the truth that destroys, but the truth that frees. The kind that lets you walk past someone who once held your heart and feel nothing but self-possession. One evening, I returned to my apartment to find a small bouquet of white lilies at my door. No note, no explanation. I set them on the kitchen counter and exhaled. It wasn't about the flowers. It was about the symbolism. I could receive gestures, I could acknowledge them, but they no longer dictated my emotions. The life I had imagined with him was over, and that was okay. I thought about the burner phone, now tucked in a drawer, recordings saved, evidence archived. There was no impulse to use them again, no urge to revisit the humiliation he had invited upon himself. They were relics of the past, proof of a chapter closed. Occasionally, curiosity tempted me. What would his family say? What would he do? But each time, I reminded myself that observation and proof were only tools, not prisons. My life wasn't tethered to them anymore. On the weekends, I began reconnecting with friends I had neglected, planning long walks in the early sun, cooking meals I loved, painting in the studio where sunlight fell across the canvas in golden angles. Each act of self-care was small but cumulative, like stitches mending the invisible wounds of betrayal. And then, unexpectedly, I felt a flicker of gratitude. Not for him, not for the pain, but for the clarity it had forced me to find. I had discovered my own resilience, my own boundaries, my own voice in the aftermath of deceit. There was liberation in recognition, the ability to see clearly, to act decisively, to leave with integrity intact. It wasn't revenge that satisfied me, it was acknowledgement. The kind that doesn't scream or demand, but quietly asserts itself through presence and composure. I could look at his family, his mother, his younger brother, and know that truth had found its way to them without me stooping to anger. That knowledge, more than anything, was the closure I needed. By the end of that week, I found myself smiling again. Not the forced, fragile kind, but a slow, genuine smile that began in my chest and reached my eyes. Mark no longer occupied the same mental space. His betrayal was a shadow I had walked past. I realized that healing isn't dramatic. It isn't loud. It's measured. It's ordinary life reclaimed piece by piece. It was a Tuesday when I finally decided to confront the full weight of what Mark had done. Not just to me, but to everyone who trusted him. The recordings on the burner phone had been my silent companion for days, a ledger of betrayal that chronicled his double life in painstaking detail. But up until now, I had mostly observed, recorded, and reflected. Watching from a distance, I could almost convince myself that life was separate from him. Almost. That evening, his family had gathered for a small Sunday-style dinner, a tradition I had once enjoyed as part of our shared life. The aroma of roasted rosemary chicken, baked potatoes, and vanilla bean pie drifted through the house. I stood in the hallway, holding the burner phone, heart steady despite the storm inside. This was the moment where silence became action, where hesitation would yield to truth. Mark greeted me with that familiar half-smile, the one I used to find charming. It faltered the instant he saw the device in my hand. His confidence, that effortless air of control, dissolved before me. "Clara, what are you doing here?" His voice was measured but tinged with nervousness. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I turned toward the family, all seated in the living room, unaware of the storm about to unfold. "I think it's time you all heard something," I said, voice calm but carrying the weight of certainty. "Something you deserve to know." His mother's brow furrowed, a faint tension in her shoulders. His father's gaze shifted from him to me, curiosity mingled with caution. And Mark. He took a step back, a subtle retreat that said more than words ever could. I pressed play. The first clip filled the room. Mark's laughter, light and familiar, mingling with someone else's voice, Lara's. The conversation was intimate, filled with inside jokes, weekend plans, and subtle references to moments I had once thought belonged exclusively to me. The room froze. His mother's hand clutched her napkin, his father's jaw tightened. Mark's eyes widened, disbelief flickering across his face. The casual charm he wore like armor now seemed fragile and ridiculous. "Mark," I said softly, my voice calm, deliberate. "Care to explain this?" He swallowed hard, attempting to form words. It's not what it looks like," he stammered. But I saw it. The micro-expressions, the slight tremble of his hands, the guilt he could no longer hide. "It's exactly what it looks like," I replied. "You've lied to me, to yourself, and now, apparently, to all of them as well." I let the silence stretch. Every second amplified the tension. A taut wire ready to snap. His mother's eyes, moist with a mixture of shock and heartbreak, met mine. "Clara, I had no idea," she whispered. "I know," I said, voice steady. "And you couldn't have. But now the truth is here. And you all deserve to see it clearly." The next few clips were even harder. Text messages I had secretly recorded, images he thought were private, and phone calls that revealed his careful orchestration of a secret life. Each revelation hit like a precise scalpel, cutting away layers of deceit. Mark's facade crumbled. His words grew frantic. "Please, Clara. I can explain." "No," I interrupted, my tone firm. "There's nothing left to explain. There's only acknowledgement. You've built a life of lies, and now it's in front of everyone who trusted you. That's your reckoning." I watched as the family processed the evidence. His younger brother's expression shifted from curiosity to silent disapproval. His mother's face mirrored shock, hurt, and the slow dawning of betrayal. The man I once loved, whose smile could light up a room, was reduced to silence, his pride dismantled piece by piece. After what felt like an eternity, I stood. My movements were deliberate, measured. I placed the burner phone on the coffee table. The recording paused, but the evidence clear for anyone to review. "I'm done," I said simply. "This ends here for me." I could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't dramatic yelling or confrontation that dismantled him. It was the clarity of truth. That, and the knowledge that I would no longer be the person bending around his lies, trying to fill the gaps he created. As I walked toward the door, Mark's voice, barely audible, called after me. "Clara, please don't go like this." I didn't turn. I didn't need to. The distance between us was more than physical. It was moral, emotional, and irrevocable. I had reclaimed my narrative. I had placed the burden of consequence squarely where it belonged. Outside, the cool night air wrapped around me, brushing against my skin like a cleansing wave. I breathed deeply, the scent of damp earth and distant rain grounding me in the moment. The weight I hadn't realized I had carried, the uncertainty, the fear, the longing for trust, was gone. I was free, not because he had fallen, but because I had stepped into my own strength. Walking home, I thought about the years of subtle lies I had ignored, the moments when intuition had whispered warnings I chose to silence. But I also thought about the resilience I had discovered, the courage it had taken to confront, to act, to hold space for truth without resorting to cruelty. That, I realized, was my victory. The days after that night were quieter than I expected. Mark didn't reach out again, at least not directly. His presence in my life had been reduced to fleeting messages through mutual friends and occasional sightings in public spaces, but each encounter was brief and uneventful. What struck me most wasn't relief, exactly. It was the weightlessness that comes from walking away intact, unshaken in your core. I spent the mornings in the small cafe down the street, sipping black coffee and sketching in my notebook. There was a peace there, a soft rhythm in the clinking of cups, the low murmur of conversations, the faint scent of brewed coffee and cinnamon. My thoughts wandered often back to the recordings, to the moment I had pressed play in front of his family, and the exact expression of shock on his face. It wasn't revenge that had satisfied me, it was acknowledgement. That, I realized, was far more powerful. A week later, I received a message from his mother. Short, simple, tentative. Can we talk? I hesitated. My instinct was to say no. My boundaries had been violated for years, and yet I also understood the importance of closure. Not just for me, but for them. So I agreed. We met at the same cafe, and I could immediately see the exhaustion in her eyes, the emotional toll that had carried through the week. I wanted to understand, she began, voice soft. We never imagined he could do something like this. I know, I said gently. But understanding doesn't mean excusing. It means seeing clearly. She nodded, her hands clasped around a warm cup of tea. There was a moment of silence, shared recognition of how fragile trust can be, and how easily it can be shattered. We spoke for nearly an hour, unpacking memories, moments, and choices. I told her about the subtle signs I had noticed, the growing unease that had made me act. She listened without judgment, only with a desire to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. By the time I left, there was a fragile sort of understanding between us. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. I realized that healing wasn't about dramatic gestures or fiery confrontations. It was quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal. Work became my anchor. I poured myself into my designs, into the projects that had once felt mundane. Each completed task was a small victory, a reclaiming of focus and energy that had been misdirected for years. Colleagues noticed a difference in my demeanor. Calm, assertive, purposeful. There was no bitterness, no desire for retaliation, only clarity. I started reconnecting with friends I had neglected. Long walks through the park, weekend brunches filled with laughter, even the occasional movie night. Small acts, ordinary yet profoundly restorative. I began painting again, letting colors spill across the canvas, guided not by perfection, but by emotion. There was liberation in creating for myself, without expectation, without compromise. And then, almost imperceptibly, I began to notice moments of self-reflection that were gentle, not punishing. I thought about Mark, not with anger, but with understanding that his choices were a reflection of him, not of my worth. I recognized that trust broken is not always a mirror of personal failure. It is sometimes merely the consequence of misaligned values. One evening, as the city lights flickered outside my window, I opened the burner phone for the last time. The recordings were still there, the evidence of deceit undeniable. Yet I didn't feel the compulsion to replay them. They were no longer tools of judgment, but relics of a chapter one had fully closed. I placed the phone in a drawer, locking it away as a symbolic gesture. What had been recorded was important, but my life, my choices, my healing were more so. Then came an unexpected encounter. I ran into Mark at a local market, the kind of mundane coincidence that seemed almost scripted. He froze when he saw me, his posture stiff, eyes wide. For a moment, the air between us was taut with all that had passed. He started to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize, but I held up a hand, stopping him. I don't need your words, I said quietly. I only need my life back. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, the shame and understanding in his expression clear. I turned and walked away, the hum of the market blending with the rustle of leaves outside. That simple act, that step forward, felt like the first unencumbered stride I had taken in years. Back in my apartment, I sat on the windowsill, a cup of tea warming my hands, the city alive below me. I thought about the journey, of suspicion, of betrayal, of action, of truth, and finally of healing. I realized that the moment we reclaim our narrative, step into our own agency, and release the need to control outcomes for others, we gain something far more enduring than revenge. Peace. Weeks passed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt unshakably mine. The initial shock, the adrenaline of exposure, the tension of confrontation, All had given way to a quieter, steadier sense of self. I woke each morning no longer second-guessing the sounds of my phone, no longer wondering about his whereabouts, no longer holding my breath waiting for some revelation that might undo the closure I had finally achieved. I found myself savoring small things that had once been background noise. The faint smell of toast browning in the morning, the way sunlight hit the hardwood floor in geometric patterns, the distant laughter of children playing in the park below. Ordinary life felt richer, more vivid, because it was entirely mine, untouched by deceit or manipulation. One evening, I received a message from an unknown number. Curiosity tugged at me, though I resisted the temptation to rush. When I finally opened it, it was Mark. Just 2 words. "I'm sorry." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I thought about the recordings, the confrontation, the way his family had witnessed everything. I thought about the nights I had spent wondering if I could ever trust again. The mornings I had cried into my coffee, the sense of helplessness I had felt when the truth was hidden behind his lies. And then I realized, I didn't need his apology. Not for my peace, not for my clarity, not for the dignity I had reclaimed. My reply was simple. I deleted the message. That small, deliberate act was a final affirmation that my life was no longer intertwined with his. That weekend, I took a long walk through the neighborhood, breathing deeply, feeling the crisp autumn air fill my lungs. Leaves crunched beneath my feet, and for the first time in months, I felt free from the weight of expectation, betrayal, and uncertainty. I was alone, yes, but for the first time, alone felt like empowerment. I met a few friends for brunch later that day. Conversation flowed easily, laughter punctuating the air, the mundane topics of work and family blending with subtle reflections on life. No one mentioned Mark, and that was exactly the way I wanted it. I was no longer defined by his choices, no longer tethered to his deceit. Over the next few weeks, I began reconnecting with parts of myself that I had neglected. Painting, writing, early morning runs, even a cooking class I had once dismissed as frivolous. Each activity was a stitch, weaving together the tapestry of a life I was intentionally rebuilding. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. Then came a moment that surprised me. Mark's younger brother reached out. Not to accuse, not to defend, but simply to speak. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, "for showing the truth, for being honest. I've been angry at him, but I didn't know how deep it went. You did the right thing." His words were unexpected, yet grounding. They reminded me that truth has a ripple effect, touching lives beyond our own. Sometimes the moral weight of an action isn't felt immediately. It lingers quietly, shaping the people around you in ways they may not fully understand. A few days later, I walked past the park where Mark and I had once sat for hours, discussing everything from dreams to trivial worries. I paused at the bench we used to share, running my fingers along the wood, remembering the laughter and the tenderness that had once existed. There was a pang of sadness, but it was sharp and brief. Not the consuming grief I had known before, but a reflection, an acknowledgement of what had been and what could no longer be. At home, I picked up my journal, now filled with reflections, plans, and sketches of moments both past and imagined. I wrote about the lessons learned, the courage to trust intuition, the strength required to confront betrayal, the wisdom in reclaiming one's life before anger or revenge can consume it. Each word was deliberate, a record of survival, of growth, of moral victory. Sometimes I still think about Mark. I imagine him navigating the consequences of his choices, seeing how his actions impacted those he loved. But the thought no longer carries bitterness, it carries clarity. I am no longer a part of that narrative. I am the author of my own. And it is one filled with integrity, resilience, and the quiet power of truth. The final piece of this chapter came unexpectedly. I bumped into a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in months. A kind woman with a soft smile. "You seem lighter," she said. "Happier. There's something different about you." I smiled, realizing she was right. The freedom I had earned, the agency I had reclaimed, the moral clarity I had found, it showed. It wasn't flamboyant or dramatic. It wasn't a shout into the void. It was quiet, resolute, and enduring. The weeks that followed felt almost ordinary, but ordinary in the way that comes after turbulence. A calm shaped by experience, edged with lessons learned. I began noticing small things I had overlooked in my rush to survive the chaos. The soft hum of my heater in the morning, the scent of wet pavement after a rain, the way neighbors greeted each other with casual warmth. It was as if the world had slowed down just enough for me to see it in focus, unclouded by fear or doubt. Then one evening, I received an unexpected visit. It was Mark's mother. She stood hesitantly at my door, holding a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. Her eyes flickered with something between shame and gratitude. "I wanted to give you this," she said softly. "It belonged to my grandmother. I thought you might appreciate it." I took the box, feeling its weight in my hands. Inside was a delicate locket, its surface etched with tiny, intricate patterns, tarnished slightly with age but beautiful nonetheless. I could see the care in her choice. It wasn't an apology I needed, but an acknowledgement, a bridge between honesty and understanding. "Thank you," I said, voice steady. "I'll treasure it." We sat together for a while, talking quietly about life, mistakes, and the strange ways in which truth reshapes relationships. There was no bitterness, no accusation. Just a soft recognition that actions have consequences, and that sometimes those consequences ripple out farther than expected. In the days that followed, news of Mark's betrayal seemed to spread in subtle ways through his social circle. Mutual friends, colleagues, and even distant relatives began to understand the depth of his deception. I never sought this attention, never aimed to humiliate him. The fallout happened naturally, a product of undeniable truth and the careful way I had revealed it. At work, my focus sharpened even more. Designs, presentations, and projects were completed with a clarity I hadn't known I possessed. Colleagues noticed the difference. Some asked if I was okay, sensing a shift in my energy. I didn't feel the need to explain. The change was visible not in words but in presence. One afternoon, I received a message from Mark's younger brother. "I wanted to say thanks again," he wrote. "Seeing how you handled everything, it taught me a lot. About integrity. About strength. About standing up for yourself." I paused before replying. I could have ignored the message, dismissed it, or even responded with snark. Instead I wrote, "I'm glad you understand. Life is too short to be carried by lies." There was a weight to my words, a moral certainty that felt satisfying in a way vengeance never could. I was no longer tethered to his mistakes. I was free to observe the consequences without being emotionally entangled. That, I realized, was the ultimate liberation. As autumn deepened, the air turned crisp and leaves fell like golden confetti, marking the passage of time. I walked through the park daily, allowing the rhythm of nature to mirror the steady pacing of my own recovery. Children laughed on swings, couples strolled hand in hand, and the world seemed to pulse with a quiet continuity. I was part of it, yet apart from the chaos that had once defined my life. One evening, I ran into a friend I hadn't seen in months. We shared a long hug, and she remarked on the difference in me. "You seem lighter, more grounded, happier," she said. I smiled, realizing she was right. It wasn't happiness in the way of excitement or thrill. It was a calm, steady contentment rooted in self-possession. I thought about the burner phone one last time. The recording sat quietly in my drawer, a testament to truth and evidence of the betrayal I had endured. I didn't need to replay them. I didn't need to relive anger or humiliation. They were no longer a tool, they were history. I was living in the present, fully, freely, and on my own terms. Occasionally, I would reflect on the journey. The suspicion, the meticulous planning, the recording, the confrontation, the public reveal, and finally the peace that followed. Every step had required courage, patience, and moral clarity. Every moment had reinforced that integrity, once exercised, shapes not only outcomes but self-perception. I had proven to myself that I could face deception, act decisively, and move forward without losing dignity. Mark had become a ghost in my life. Not in a haunting way, but in the sense that his choices no longer affected me. He was a part of my past, a reference point, but not a determinant of my present or future. And that distinction, between past and self-determined present, was the difference between survival and empowerment. At night, I often sat by the window, looking at the city lights flickering in the distance. The quiet hum of life below reminded me that the world moves on, indifferent to individual betrayals, yet full of opportunities to reclaim one's own narrative. I had done that. I had acted, revealed, and walked away healed. The moral of my story wasn't in dramatic revenge or public humiliation. It was in the deliberate reclaiming of self, the measured exposure of truth, and the decision to no longer be defined by someone else's deceit. I had survived, yes, but more importantly, I had thrived in the aftermath. The clarity of truth, the act of walking away with dignity, and the conscious rebuilding of my life were the gifts I had taken from betrayal. By the time winter settled in, my life had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. The crisp air brought with it a quiet kind of reflection, a calm that only comes after storms have passed. I had learned to notice the small details that make life meaningful. The way steam rises from a cup of hot chocolate, the way my scarf smelled faintly of lavender after a walk, the distant echoes of holiday lights and music from neighbors' homes. It was ordinary, yes, but ordinary had become precious. I spent more time with friends, people whose loyalty and kindness had remained steadfast through my upheaval. There was laughter now that wasn't shadowed by suspicion or anxiety. Our conversations, once surface level, had deepened into honest exchanges about life, choices, and the lessons we carried. I realized how much my previous relationship had dulled my ability to connect genuinely, and this reconnection felt like breathing again after holding my breath too long. One afternoon, while preparing a small holiday gathering, I reflected on the events that had led me here. The burner phone, the recordings, the confrontation. It had all been a test of courage and moral clarity. I thought about Mark, not with lingering bitterness, but with the neutral acknowledgement of someone whose actions had consequences that ultimately did not dictate my own life. That evening, I hosted a modest dinner at my apartment. Candles flickered across the room, casting warm light over familiar faces, and the smell of roasted vegetables and spiced cider filled the space. Conversations flowed naturally, moments of silence punctuated by soft laughter. It was simple, ordinary, yet rich with the texture of genuine human connection. Mark's family had reached out earlier that week, not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge and thank me in their own way. His mother sent a message about the locket she had given me, expressing that it symbolized her appreciation for my courage and honesty. His younger brother had also continued to check in occasionally, sharing reflections about integrity and lessons learned. It was a strange form of closure, one that wasn't dictated by apologies or restitution, but by acknowledgement of truth and its ripple effects. I thought often about the choices I had made, how I could have ignored suspicion, avoided confrontation, and let deception persist. But choosing action, deliberate and dignified, had reshaped the narrative entirely. I had turned fear and uncertainty into clarity, betrayal into a catalyst for personal growth, and anger into purposeful strength. A week before the new year, I went for a walk in the park, the frost coating the grass like fine sugar. The air was crisp, my breaths visible as clouds in the pale afternoon light. Children played at the edge of the playground, their laughter ringing clear. Couples strolled together, wrapped in scarves and the quiet comfort of companionship. I paused on a familiar bench, one I had visited before in moments of reflection, and I allowed myself a long, unguarded breath. I thought about forgiveness, not necessarily for Mark, not yet, but for myself. Forgiveness, I realized, was not about excusing behavior or erasing betrayal. It was about releasing the grip of the past, the tension of anger, and the power that his deceit once held over me. I had discovered that the most profound form of justice isn't always punishment. It's reclaiming your life fully, intentionally, and without compromise. Returning home, I settled into my evening routine with a sense of calm that had eluded me for months. I lit a candle, opened my journal, and wrote down reflections on resilience, integrity, and the quiet power of truth. Each word was deliberate, a testament to the journey I had endured and the clarity I had earned.